Welcome back. This is the lecture for week 9 with the title The Medieval Renaissance, which I'll talk about shortly. But this is the only lecture for this week because if this were an in-person class where we were meeting every Monday, Wednesday, or every Tuesday and Thursday, this is the week technically of fall break. So we would not be meeting on either Monday or Tuesday. So there's just one lecture for this week. And then next week, the end of next week, is your second midterm. So that's what this is all leading up to. And so there's only one lecture for next week. Now, these two lectures that are videoed, there's only one written lecture for, with the title of Medieval Renaissance. But that covers what I'll be talking about next lecture, which is the flowering of the Middle Ages, which is going into the 13th century. All kind of as part of the same thing, because we see a series of developments beginning in about the year 1000, give or take some, that led to a real rebirth of culture, learning, a shift and change in economic structures and programs, of social aspects, political aspects. And it is really the time when Europe is really taking off. I'll be talking about all those different aspects. I just want to kind of put the frame in terms of this course and where we are and where we're going in context. So that's what this is all about. And naturally, too, I think, or I hope you will know that there's a lot squeezed into this lecture and next lecture for next week. And I'll try not to, again, allow myself to get carried away. And I just want you to know that, again, this is not comprehensive. I'm focusing on areas that I think are central importance. And not that other areas are not, but we'll go from there and see what we can come up with. Now, the term the medieval Renaissance was not a term at the time. It was basically, and I won't go into the whole history here, a term derived from a book published in 1926 by Charles Homer Haskins, who was an American medievalist who, in 1926, published a book called The Renaissance of the 12th Century. Now, this began what was called the Revolt of the Medievalists. And here I'm talking about historiography. We talked about in the last workshop the difference between historiography and kind of history. In response to Renaissance scholars who saw everything of good beginning with the Renaissance, and that's where we get the term the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages too, as being backward and all those things, all the negative connotations to the medieval world, and the term medieval itself derived from the Renaissance scholars beginning with Burckhardt in the 1960s. And especially his followers, who just assumed that interpretation was the way it actually was. And medievalists started to say, well, wait a minute, that's not really quite the case. And what Charles Homer Haskins did was write this book in 1926, arguing that a lot of the development that had been seen from Burckhardt on as being unique with the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance of the late 14th on into the 15th centuries, were already developments of the 12th century. We already find those same kind of developments in the 12th century. And from that, then it's like, okay, well, this gets back to the issue of periodization. Was it simply January 1st, 1100 that we begin seeing this rebirth, or do we have to trace it back earlier? And did it all stop, or was it all completed by December 31st, 1199? So the idea of this 12th century Renaissance became expanded, and so it was started to become referred to as just the medieval Renaissance. I'm not so concerned with that debate here and now. I want you to be aware of it. But what I want you to see, and what I hope to present to you in this lecture, is a series of developments that radically changed Christendom. Not in a fundamental sense, but internally, in terms of developments herein, we left off basically the basic structures of Christendom, and those remain fundamental. But to see how they developed and grew, so to speak, over the next, let's say, 3 or 4 centuries. That's what this is all about. And we see, again, a number of developments, and I'll be saying this probably repeatedly, again, around the year 1000, that led to renewal and growth. And so we can say, well, is that really rebirth? Because that's what Renaissance means, rebirth. And I talked about the Carolingian Renaissance, when I talked about the Carolingian world in Charlemagne, that was really kind of a rebirth of learning and things. And so do we have to go back to the Carolingian period and the 9th century to talk about the Renaissance? It gets kind of complex. But again, those kind of debates are important. And I want you to know them, or at least know about them. But I want to look at really what the kind of the content. Talk about, the interpretation, and then that which is being interpreted. So here we have the interpretation of Renaissance as this big category. What did it constitute, and how do we define it? And then I want to look at what is being interpreted as that in this lecture, which is then my interpretation of that which is interpreted as potentially a Renaissance. That's kind of the whole point of all this. I should also note, I think I mentioned this in the written lectures, that the 12th century Giles Constable, back in the, I think it was in the mid to late 90s, wrote a book, The Reformation of the 12th Century, because he argued that there was a fundamental change within the religious life in the 12th century, as fundamental as that would become about in the 16th century. And we can debate that, but were there developments within the religious life? Yes, there were, and I'll be talking about some of those as we go, because some of those developments preceded other developments that were, I'm not going to say far more important, but some of the major developments of the medieval Renaissance began with some of the monastic reform movements. But we'll get there when we get there, and I think you'll see what I mean. Anyway, that's kind of the preface. And I've already now spent far too much time simply on the introduction. But we'll see how far we go. And if I have to go overtime, I'm sorry, I probably will, because this is very important, and also leading up to your second exam is important. So bear with me, and let's see what we're talking about. We're talking about a series of developments, and the first is the economic and social developments, because around the year 100, around the year 1000, not the year 100, we find a series of developments that were of significant impact. And we begin here with simply the rise of population. We begin, if we were to chart the population increase in Europe from, let's say, 500 to 1500, it would go off slow, and then right about the year 100 it starts taking off until we get to 1347, 48 from then, and it crashes. But we'll get to that point when we get there, because that was due primarily to what was been referred to as the plague. But until that point, until the mid 14th century, there's a steady increase, and a significantly steady increase in population. Now, that causes questions of how does population increase and what is required for it. I'm not going to go into the biology of it. I think we all know what the biological background to the increase in population is, but then in some ways we say, well, what allowed for that to happen? And if you have more people, don't you need more food? Yes, you do. And so the question is, did the food production increase first, or did the population rise come about first? In some ways, it's the chicken and the egg kind of question. There's no way we can really answer it, because in order to have more people, to support more people, you have to have more food. But to have more food, you need to have more people. And so it's a real issue and problem, because the latter is, why have more food if you don't have more people to feed? So that is a problem. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. I don't think on the quiz there is which came first, the population increase or the increase in agricultural production, because that would be an erroneous question to ask, because there's no answer. They go hand in hand. And we see that in what led to the increased production were a number of factors, also technological factors. And I have up here the agricultural economic takeoff, in quotation marks. And this is the rise of towns and communes. And we'll get to the rise of towns and communes in a moment, but that was all predicated on the economic agricultural takeoff. Now, takeoff is an economic term. Obviously, we use it for airplanes. When you go to the airport, you go fly somewhere. There's the moment of takeoff, and with rockets, we have liftoff. But takeoff in the economic sense, if you've had economics, you probably already know this, is when an economy starts to exponentially grow, or either arithmetically or the other one exponentially, arithmetic and exponential. I think it's arithmetically. But when the curve all of a sudden whoop, that's the point of takeoff. And we see that around the year 1000. And what led to that? Well, there are a number of technological developments that led to that takeoff of agricultural production, which, as I said before, was the basis of wealth in Christendom. As we go through basically the rest of this course and on into the 114. I have up there the agricultural economic takeoff from the 2-field system to the 3-field system. Now, what that was, if you remember, I think in the written lecture, Basic Structures of Christendom, when we talked about manorialism, there was an image of a constructed image of a manor with different fields. Now, I said there were strips of land. Again, we're idealized to explain this, especially with, I'm just going to simplify it by saying a field, arable land. What they would do previously is they had what's called the 2-field system. If you know anything about agriculture, you cannot farm a piece of land year after year after year after year and expect the same results. After a while, as the law of diminishing returns sets in, the land becomes depleted, it hasn't replenished itself, and the yield goes way down. They were aware of that factor and have been for a long time. So they would follow what was called a 2-field system. So if you have a field, you kind of divide it in half and plant one field one year, letting the other side, the other half of the field, go fallow, just grow naturally, and then that would replenish it with nutrients of the plants that would go, and it's like a natural fertilizer. They could graze their animals on that part of it, and then just farm the other half, and then the next year they'd switch those halves. That 2-field system worked pretty well. But what developed around the year 1000 was someone, we don't have any idea whom it was or who first developed this idea. What if we did it in thirds? Rather than halves, how about if we did it in thirds? So that instead of having field 1 and field 2, we'll have field 1, 2, and 3. And in year 1, we'll plant and harvest agriculturally fields 1 and 2. And field 3 will be fallow and also for grazing. And then in year 2, we will harvest and plant field 2 and 3, and field 1 will lie fallow and for grazing. And then in year 3, we'll plant 3 and 1, and 2 will lie fallow. So namely, it'd be a 3-year cycle. And the question was whether or not a third of the field could be farmed 2 years in a row, and then only 1 year fallow, if that would be sufficient to replenish it. And they found out that basically it was. And so this all of a sudden increased production just by doing the field and farming the field in thirds rather than in half, because instead of, I think I'm going to do the math real quickly, instead of having 3/6 of your field in production, now you have 4/6 of your field, 2/3 in production. So that increases the yield, and the yield is simply how much grain is produced. Now, again, that doesn't count the grazing of animals is that on that fallow field. So that is one aspect. And then another aspect to the increase in yield and production was, I have up here the horse collar and the heavy wheeled plow. Those go together, so we'll talk about it together. The technology of farming and of plowing improved. There used to be what was called the old scratch plow. It was like a wooden plow. You just kind of drag it along. It was pulled by an ox. And it was fairly good. But all of a sudden, there was a development of the heavy wheeled plow with an iron mold board instead of wood that could cut much deeper into the soil and aerate it out much deeper, that increased the yield simply on the same piece of land. So, and I don't have the statistics here, I'm just making this up a bit, but let's say with the scratch plow, the yield was 5 to 1 for every grain of wheat planted. You get 5 grains from that. Because, seed plants the stock, whatever. But all of a sudden, with this, it would increase it from, instead of 1 to 5, it'd be like 1 and 15. So a dramatic increase with better farming techniques and technology. The problem was, though, an ox had a difficult time plowing sufficiently to get it all done, because an ox is rather slow, very strong but slow. So they tried using horses to pull the heavy-wheeled plow. Problem is, the heavy-wheeled plow was too heavy for the horse. The horse with the neck, it was not able to pull it and drag it as it's cutting through things. So that what was developed was the horse collar. If you've seen those, I don't know if you've seen the big horse collar. This is probably showing my age. There used to be the Budweiser commercials, were great commercials with the Clydesdales and their beautiful horses pulling a Budweiser wagon, and they had these big horse collars. A horse collar distributes the weight not on the horse's neck, but on the horse's shoulders. And in that sense, a horse can be very, very powerful. We talk about horsepower in cars. We don't talk about ox power, even though an ox in some ways is a lot stronger than a horse, but a horse is extremely strong when it's harnessed correctly. The development of the horse collar allowed horses to pull the heavy wheeled plow, which meant more plowing more quickly, more land could be plowed, and that deeper plowing with the heavy wheel plow allowed then the yields to go up, as we're doing in the three-field system. And also the deep wheeled plow allowed for, or heavy wheeled plow, allowed for clearing more land. Now you say, well, how does that happen? Because you don't plow. Yeah, but you do. Once you cut down forest and trees, you have to make the land arable for farming. So you have to dig through it and cultivate it and get it up, and you have to plow through it. And that takes a while. And the heavy wheel plow could do that where the scratch plow really couldn't. So more land is coming under production. And the three-field system is producing more yield as such, and the heavy wheel plow and the new farming techniques and the areability of the land is producing higher yields. So all of a sudden the food supply is really taking off. That is what was behind this economic boon of the rise of population, and all of this rise of population led to the rise of towns. Now, the rise of towns, we can talk about, I have up here the rise of towns and the rise of communes, because they're distinct. When I get to communes, I'll get to communes, but communes are a type of town or city. But the rise of towns, we can chart this based on city charters that we have from the medieval period. And around the year 1000, we begin to see an increase in the map of new towns. So if, I know I used to have one of these, and there may be one in your textbook, I don't remember, but a map of Europe in like pre-1000, there'd only be a few dots with cities and with towns. And then after, increasing number of towns on that map. So that's when we're talking about the rise of towns, is simply the number of towns that have been established. And that was all a part of the rise of population, because all of a sudden, if there's a rise in population, everyone has to be working on the farm to survive. And so this also leads to the rise of the arts, the artisans classes, and towns began to flourish. There's a movement from the country to the town, so to speak. And the crafts, arts. I'm talking about arts and crafts, but in medieval times it's the same thing. Arts, it's not just painting and all those things. It's really being a blacksmith, being a baker, and all these different artisan crafts. Um, so that is that flourishing and growth of urban living. That is what we talk about when we talk about the rise of towns. And we start to have charters and foundations. I mean, foundations is just a document saying this town was founded in 1003 when so and so. We can document these foundations. A charter is something different, and that gets us to the communes. Now, by commune, I don't mean a 1960s commune where you get together and sit around naked and smoke dope and say, "Isn't this wonderful?" and ooh la la. It was a particular form of governance of significant importance. French commune in Germany was called the Free Cities, the Reichsstädte, the Free Imperial Cities. And it went sort of like this, because we're still within the system of feudal law, keep in mind, where everyone is directly under their feudal overlord. In towns, all the people in the town were vassals, or not technically because they're not part of the homage, but they're part of the peasantry, led by their overlords. The townspeople got together and said, this is really kind of a problem. What we should do, see if we can kind of group together. We'll petition our king, or a prince, but a king, to say, look, we will pay our feudal dues, but we want to govern ourselves. We don't want our petty overlord to interfere with how we do things. Will you grant us a charter proclaiming us as a free city, a commune? We will be directly under your authority. Now, for the king, that's like, sounds good to me. Why? Because the king all of a sudden had an ally. And the town thought it was great because all of a sudden this removed the town from the feudal structure and hierarchy to place him directly underneath the authority of the king. We can say, well, didn't the overlord have a problem with that? Of course they did. They didn't want that to happen. They liked having authority over their towns. The communes said, well, sorry, you didn't take that up with the king. You're lord, you vassal. Because now we are a vassal as a city, as a whole, just like you are of the king. So if you have a problem with that, take it up with the king. So talked about sub-infeudation. The lower level lords, who were vassals of the king, were opposed to this communal movement of the communes, and yet couldn't really do anything about it politically because they too were dependent upon the king. If the king says, leave that city alone, that's my city, they have to say, oh, damn it, okay. So that is kind of the structure. All of a sudden, we have these communes being established by charter underneath the direct authority of the king, outside of the feudal structure. And why is that important too? Because this charter and this whole process was really the beginning of what we would today refer to as corporate law. Why? Because the commune, the chartered city, was given the right to function as a single person, a single body, a corporate structure. Corpus is the Latin term for body. A corporation is a body. It's a legal body. The basic definition of a corporation is a legal person, whereby a corporation can sue and be sued. You're protecting the individuals today, part of that corporation. But at this point, it was saying, okay, look, we are functioning as a whole. We will govern our internal affairs ourselves, but we are a corporate whole. Now, as the crafts started to develop in the course of the rise of the cities. Another kind of concurrent development started happening within the cities. Namely, the craftspeople started to band together and basically form unions. They were called guilds. But these unions, or guilds, were a way of organizing the various professions or craft professions as a whole. Again, as this corporate structure. So if we want to look at the origins of corporate law today, we have to go back to the 11th and 12th centuries to look at what was going on in medieval Europe, because that is where this idea comes about. And actually, there is a direct relationship to the theological developments in terms of corporate thinking, which I'll be talking about more next lecture, with the body of Christ. That too is a corporate construct. Plays into this and vice versa. So what we really have are a series of technological, economic developments that lead to rather significant social changes and developments, which lead to intellectual changes and developments. And we have this whole emergence of corporate thinking in terms of corporations, which are then like the guilds and the communes, whereby a group functions as an individual legal body. That's what we're looking at. And this was going to be very important as we go forward. And this corporate way of thinking was going to be very important as we go forward, as well as the communes themselves and the guilds themselves. But this is all developing, again, around the year 1000. And even though I'm making almost a joke of that, I'm serious about it, because we can't really date these developments specifically. And so on your midterm, you can use this phrase. Sometimes I think, in lectures I make comments or I use phrases that I would hope you would not use on your midterm, because they're by intent not intended to be scholarly or academic, but to leave an impression. But here, if you want to say, around the year 1000, we find that is fine. That is good, and you may and probably should use that reference, because it really is a turning point, this turn of the millennium, this looking for the second millennium. And a lot of people around the year 1000, before it was the late 900s, were expecting the end of the world, just like when we switched from the 1000s to the 2000s. You may not, I think probably most of you were not born yet. If you were, you're too young, but I remember the change of the year 2000 very well, Y2K. It was a lot of expectation and worry about the end of the world. In a religious, theological sense, I won't go there, but also in a secular sense, because people said, oh my God, all the computers are going to crash because they're not ready and programmed for the year 2000, blah, 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 blah. And January 1st came and nothing happened and we're all fine. The year 1000 came and nothing happened, they're all fine. But there's that anxiety leading up to it, and this time of transition, newness, change, openness, and that is all involved in this Renaissance, even if it's not a rebirth as much as it is a new development, a new birth, a nascence and not a renaissance. So that is those aspects. We have the agriculture, economic takeoff, the rise of towns, the rise of communes, and all of these posed a challenge to the feudal system, as I'm seeing there. Because once you start saying, okay, here's our structure: king, sub-feudation, lords, vassals of the king, lords over their vassals, and then the people. Once you take like some of these outside of that structure, that you can say weakens the structure. It also provides an opposition to that structure. And we'll see that too, having first developed actually with some of the monastic reforms of around the year 1000, part of this Renaissance or rebirth or newness or new birth that all was taking place more or less at the same time. and we refer to it even as the new monasticism. We have up here the new monasticism. Cluny in 910 we begin with, because I think I said previously that monasticism, as it had developed in Europe, was individual. You'd go out into the wilderness, and in the wilderness, kind of approximating the desert of the early desert fathers. So you go out in the wilderness, in the woods, seeking your own salvation. And every monastery was underneath a bishop. There was something called the Ordo Monasticus, meaning if you joined a monastery, you were part of this class, or ordo. I pointed to the importance of that word before, and this is where it can get confusing. As a state and a status, you became a religious. And statu religionis is what it was called, entering a monastic order or monastic life, because you were separate. You were not part of the ordo clericus, or the clergy, but part of the monastic. And you weren't part of the laity because you were part of the monastic sort of life. And I also then talked about how that those monasteries there needed dispensation from the bishop to have some of their members be ordained to celebrate the sacraments. And that ordination was part of the Ordo Clericus, becoming a priest. Monks were by definition lay in that they were not ordained, but they weren't part of the Ordo Laicus as such because they weren't married. And they took vows of poverty, so they were religious. And it got to be a very difficult classification. But at the time, until Cluny in 910, I'll be talking about that in a second, there was no such thing as a quote-unquote religious order. And by that, I mean not the Ordo Monasticus or the Ordo Clericus. What I mean by that order is the group, the order. There was individual monasteries comprised of individual monks. But an order is an institution. It's an international institution. The monks, in general, followed the rule of St. Benedict. I know we talked about St. Augustine's rule being the oldest, and it was, but we'll pick that back up when we get there. But the primary form of monasticism in Christendom was following the rule of St. Benedict. But there was not yet an order of St. Benedict. And that is where Cluny came in. Because Cluny wanted to be a reform. They said, these monasteries, they're not doing that great. And the religious observance isn't being really followed very much. And the rule of St. Benedict isn't being followed that much. So what Cluny did, the head of Cluny is the abbot of Cluny, went to the bishop, that's in France, Cluny is just a city in France, and said, look, we want to do things differently. We want to really live according to the ideals. We can't do that underneath the bishop. Bishops are pretty worldly and everything. But can we then govern our own selves? Now, the way monasteries grew and multiplied was that if one monastery got big enough, or too big, let's say, another house would have to be established, also under the bishop. Well, Cluny came up with this scheme of what we want to do. We say, okay, we'll be under you, but not under you, bishop. They appeal to the Pope. So, okay, Pope, can you take us out of the episcopal structure so that we will be loyal and obedient to you? And when we get too big here at Cluny, instead of just having another one, Cluny will establish what became known as daughter houses. So the head of Cluny would be the abbot of Cluny. Once that got too big, then they would have daughter houses established, led by a prior, who would be underneath the authority of the abbot of Cluny, who would be under the direct authority of the Pope, not under the authority of the bishop. Just like the communes, That's going on here first, and it may very well have preceded the whole concept of the communes removing themselves with the king's approval and sanction from the feudal structure. Here, Cluny is removing itself from the feudal structure of the episcopal authority. To say, I'm not going to be underneath these bishops who are out fighting and whoring and everything else. I want it to be directly under you, Holy Father, Pope, and we can live our lives. And the Pope sanctions Cluny, and they grow and they expand. And it's very much this pyramid scheme, because once you have Cluny, you have Pope up here, Cluny here, daughter houses in here, here, and here, and then underneath the daughter houses, here, 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 here. I can't see it, but it's that pyramid scheme. And pretty soon the abbot of Cluny was becoming extremely powerful, because the abbot of Cluny was on top of the whole pyramid, with only answerable to the Pope. And if the bishops didn't like it, they could go to hell, because Cluny had the authority of the Pope over the bishops. Just as the communes, if the direct overlord, feudal overlord of a commune didn't like it, they could go to hell, because the commune had the authority and backing of the king. Again, it's a structural fissure in the feudal structure, as well as a brilliant development. Now, so that was Cluny, that began this, what we call the new monasticism. We have up here, the new monasticism consists of Cluniac monasticism under Cluny, and the Augustinian canons and the Cistercians, which I'll talk about in a second. There was this sense, too, of the need to really live a Christian life thoroughly. We see that with Cluny. We see that in general. There's a huge upsurge in pastoral care, a huge upsurge in preaching and teaching the people, all around, beginning around the year 1000. And this was a time, too, when this great scholar, John Van Ingen, very good scholar, influential scholar. I shouldn't call him a great scholar, but he's a good guy. He wrote a very influential article called The Christianization of the Middle Ages, where he argued that, Christendom, Europe, by the year 1000 was Christian. The Christianization process had been completed, with a few peripheral exceptions, and with the exceptions of the Jews within Christendom, the boundaries of Christendom. I refer to this new development as religionization. That's my term. Christianization has been around, talking about the conversion of the barbarians, the pagans, the conversion. So it's like, now what? I talked about Gregory of Tours early on, and what did it mean to be Christian when you were a Frank under Clovis, and so. But now that the issue was, now that we're Christian, now that the Christianization has taken place, how do we really make people Christian? What does it really mean to be Christian? And that was the question that was behind so much development from this point on, from around the year 1000. And we see it in the parish clergy, we see it in the monastic lives and developments. And that led to this upsurge in attempts to reform, to go back to the ideals, some of the original ideals, and often the original ideals of what did it mean to live a Christian life was following the apostles, the apostolic life. They were the first Christian community after Jesus. How did they do things? They lived in common. They provided for everybody according to their needs. And they followed Jesus. Naked and poor following the naked and poor Christ. It became a very frequently repeated theme. And that led priests attached to a cathedral, or the canons, this is the Augustinian canons, to start reforming themselves too. Now, I think I mentioned the canons. We're talking about the. No, I don't think so. I didn't. What was a canon? besides a thing that goes boom, or what is a canon besides the scripture, the determination of what books belong in scriptures, the canon of literature. A canon at this time was a priest attached to a cathedral. Why they're called canons, I really can't answer that question for you. But why would a priest be attached to a cathedral? Because a priest, by definition, is in charge of a parish. A bishop is in charge of a cathedral. But bishops, I just kind of alluded to, were far more worldly. They're usually rather noble people, not always, or certainly not by definition, but de facto they often were. And they didn't really want to be pastors. They didn't want to sit here and have to preach and listen to confessions and celebrate the sacraments. They were administrators. So what they would do would be appoint priests to actually run the diocese, the pastoral functions of the diocese. And those priests who, instead of being assigned to a parish, were attached to a cathedral, became known as the cathedral canons. They often would then took over the function of choosing the bishop. I remembered back in the day, in the 4th century, it talked about Ambrose, St. Ambrose of Milan, and the people just exclaimed that he was bishop. Well, it started becoming customary that the canons of the cathedral would choose the bishop, often from their own ranks. You could also be appointed as a canon, so we'll see how that comes back later, because these canons were not all necessarily sweet spiritual people, but a lot of them were, and some of those that wanted to be truly religious people said, you know what, we should start following a monastic rule. We should reform ourselves. How are we going to do that? We're going to follow a rule. Well, we can't really follow the rule of St. Benedict, because that is for monks who are supposed to get away from society, whereas priests are to minister to society. And as priests of the cathedral, that is our task. The rule of St. Augustine was written for us, was written for his own priest, because Augustine was a bishop who still had monks living with him and around him, and so he wrote a rule for his monks. And we'll see this conflict coming back later on. I think I may have mentioned that I'm at this point still and believe in the rule of St. Augustine, at least one particular form of it, is authentic, and I believe that based on the evidence that Luke Verheyen has presented. Even though there were a lot of documents running around there at the time referred to as the rule of St. Augustine, but were not by Augustine. But there is a core part of that was authentic, and we'll see later, because Augustine was not simply, as I think I talked about, a bishop. He also was monastic, quote-unquote, a hermit. And did he write his rule for his hermits, or did he write it for his priests in the cathedral? That became a major debate in the 14th century, which I'll get to. And one of importance of extreme political importance at the time, which I'll get to as well, I hope. But here, at this point, the canons started saying we can follow the rule of St. Augustine and still be canons and fulfill our functions in society. So they did that. They said, okay, we, not en masse, not every canon, but there was a movement within all the canons to start following a monastic rule. And they became known as the regular canons. Now, just as Cluny became, let's say, the first religious order in the sense of institution, the Augustinian canons became the second, basically. They became an order in the sense of institution themselves. And even there was a subgroup thereof that at the cathedral in Premontre, or Premonstratensians, they're called the Premonstratensians, that were established as a distinct order separately from the cathedrals and being canons, following the rule of St. Augustine. And technically, we'll get to this next lecture next week, but the Dominicans considered themselves as canons following Augustine's rule. But we'll get there when we get there, because there's a whole new development of monasticism in the 13th century. So these Augustinian canons, also called regular canons. And why are they called regular canons? Because they followed a rule. They've also been referred to as the Augustinian regular canons because they followed the rule of St. Augustine. That's so important. And it was a major development. So we have the Cluniac monasticism, we have the development of the Augustinian and the canons, Augustinian canons, the regular canons, and they too began to be under the authority of the Pope rather than the bishop. So they are being taken out of direct episcopal control, even though there's originally canons from the cathedral, but now they are saying, no, we need to go our own way. We'll still serve our function for the cathedral, but we need to go our own way, have our own institution. And that just then develops and would then lead to another development, namely known as the Cistercians, which was a reform movement of Cluny. Now, if you look at the Cistercians up there, I have them, 1098 is their foundation. So, 180 years after Cluny, because power corrupts, as we all know, and Cluny became very powerful. The abbot of Cluny became extremely powerful, so that corruption started coming in, and there was a group of people who were members of monasteries, part of Cluny, the Cluniac monasticism, and they thought, we need to do things better. So they kind of succeeded from Cluny with papal approval and established their own order modeled after Cluny, but they were going to do it right. And the city they were doing this in was Citeaux in France. And so because of that, they became known as the Cistercians. Really important order, one of the most important medieval monastic institutions. That if you study the Middle Ages and the later Middle Ages, you'll see again and again and again. One of the most well-known figures in the Middle Ages is Bernard of Clairvaux. And he was from Clairvaux, which was kind of a reform, no, from a daughter house of Citeaux. The Cistercians also then had the daughter houses. When Citeaux got big enough, the leader of Citeaux sent a number of people to found a new house in Clairvaux, and that was where the Bernard was part of, and we'll see that how Bernard plays into the story I'm telling here shortly. So anyway, that is kind of where that is coming about. And what we are having here is this emergence of institutions. Institutions distinct from the feudal order, whether it is the lay hierarchy or the ecclesiastical hierarchy, which causes tensions within those legal structures. I'll be talking later after the midterm about the beginning of the crumbling of Christendom. Well, it kind of begins already here. We find the beginnings of corporate thinking. We find the beginnings of new organizations and new structures and new theory to go behind it, and new approach to say we need to go out into the world and transform it. We need to teach people how to be Christians. Not good enough simply to be baptized and go to Mass. We need to teach them how to be Christian. And this becomes a major focus for these new orders, even though Cluny was still withdrawn in that Benedictine sense, but the Cistercians and the Premonstratensians did try to reach the people and transform the people, their minds, their hearts. It is almost a mass campaign of popular opinion and social consciousness and awareness that led to a cultural intellectual change of what's going on in Europe. Now, that is that one. I have 2 slides left. I think what I will do, because I'm spending more time than I realized, I think I'll make a break here and then include a part two, and we'll see how we go. Hopefully part two won't be as long as part one, but it could be because of all the importance. And I'm sorry for all of this, but we'll get through it the best we can. So I will be back shortly with doing part two, and we'll go from there. Okay, thank you. See you soon.